All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, last time we finished up the third section of the miracles/actions of Jesus that we see recorded in those Gospels. And now we're going to move on to the third and final section of teachings that we see from Jesus. Now, that's not to say that we're not going to see any more miracles or actions from Jesus or any more teachings of Jesus later on in this study, but this is the last of it where we have to kind of move away from the natural chronological way of studying it, because it's just very unclear when Jesus did what. In this middle section, when you start off at the very beginning, it's really easy to figure out when Jesus did what. And when you get to the end, you get a pretty good idea of when this happened. In the middle, the organization of the Gospels kind of goes everywhere, and it doesn't really seem to be that concerned with the chronology of it. But we're almost done with that section, so we're going to go into this last section of teachings. And we're going to start off in Mark's Gospel, and we're going to be in Mark chapter 8. I believe we're going to be in Mark chapter 8. Did I not read my own? Mark chapter 9. I can't read my own handwriting. Mark chapter 9 and verse 33 is where we're starting. And you can also see an equivalent in Matthew chapter 18. In fact, I think we're going to read that one as well, although it will be very similar. Verse 33 of Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in his house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called to the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." And I'm also going to skip down a few verses to verse 42. "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea." The reason I add that one in is because that in Matthew's account, that's all put in at once. Now, maybe it wasn't said that way originally. It's hard to say. The point is, again, this is not necessarily chronology. It's not saying Jesus said this, then he said this. It's Jesus said this at some point, and he said this at some point. Now, maybe he did say this all at once, but let's go ahead and look at Matthew's account, and let's see the similarities. Matthew 18, beginning in verse 1. "At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them, and said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea.'" All right. So we see he's very much talking about the same thing. I wanted to start with this one partially just because, as far as I can tell, this is the beginning of the next round of teachings, but it also dovetails very nicely into what we were just talking about at the end of the actions of Jesus, because you might recall that there was a point in which Jesus encouraged children to come to him, despite the fact that his disciples were trying to prevent that. So we're still within the theme of children here. Mark seems to give us a little bit more of a description. Matthew seems to be a little bit more direct into how this came about. Matthew seems to make it sound like the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Which one of us will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" I don't think this is really a contradiction so much as Matthew just trying to get to the point really quickly. Whereas Mark, he says that Jesus knew that this was a dispute among them. and he deals with it. So he calls to himself a child, and it says that he holds him in his arms. And he says that whoever turns and becomes like this child, he will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's a couple things I'd point out on this. I first of all want to point out one of the most common heresies, and I am going to use that strong word to refer to this doctrine, but it is a heresy that are taught by so-called Christians. And this is something that is taught pretty consistently both by Catholics and Protestants. And I got to tell you, it's about as far from what the Bible actually teaches as you could possibly get. And that is the teaching that children are inherently sinful. Now, as far as I can trace it back, this teaching goes all the way back to Augustine of Hippo. That would be a 4th century teacher that, again, even Protestants seem to include in their teachings what he taught, which is the idea of original sin. Now, that idea is this. The sinfulness that you have has nothing to do, well, I suppose it has something to do with your personal actions. But even if you had not personally acted in a way that was contrary to the law of God, you would still be guilty of sin because you inherited that sin all the way from Adam. Now, the Bible completely denies this idea. Ezekiel chapter 18, there's a big point that Ezekiel makes of refuting that idea. God says to the children of Israel that you've been saying a proverb among yourselves that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. A very similar, he says, don't say this anymore. Instead, what you ought to be saying is that the soul who sins will die. The point is this, you all were saying we're being punished for what our fathers did. You're being punished for what you will do, or what you have done. Very similar idea needs to be applied over here. Now, let's ask ourselves a question. If children are inherently sinful, if they were born sinful, why does Jesus say you should become like children? Now, someone might say, well, he's not talking about the aspect of sinlessness in children. He's talking about the humility of children, which I agree, that's part of what Jesus is talking about. But look at Matthew's phrasing here. Verse 2, and calling to him a child, he put them in the midst of them and said, truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children. Unless you turn and become like children, or we might phrase it a synonym to turn, unless you repent and become like children. He's referencing, again, the innocence of children. It's very disturbing to me just how extremely common this damaging false doctrine is. Can you imagine how that paints God? That does not paint God as the righteous judge of the universe. It paints God as a vindictive and frankly evil being which would look upon something, anybody who interacts with children, the innocent, I've been interacting with a child, of course, a whole lot recently, ever since my first was born. And the innocence of the child, it's just so obvious. And anyone who interacts with children for a prolonged amount of time, or really any amount enough just to think about it, the innocence there is obvious. They're not guilty of sin, and they're certainly not guilty. He's certainly not guilty of my sin. And so to say that God is going to look at this somebody as sinful because of my actions, that's unrighteous. You're depicting a perfectly righteous God as an unrighteous tyrant. And I can't abide by that. Another problem, of course, with this is if humanity is sinful just by virtue of being born, then that would also make Jesus sinful, which is why you have such, quite frankly, flights of fancy regarding the doctrine of the birth of Christ. When you hear references to Immaculate Conception, for example, that's usually not even referencing Christ, but it's referencing Mary, that for some reason she was born without sin, even though everybody else is. There is no strong argument or even valid argument being made that they would be different than everybody else. Again, very common doctrine, completely wrong. Jesus said, "Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest of the kingdom of heaven, and unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, what happens when you enter the kingdom of heaven? That's not talking about actual heaven right now, by the way. This is definitely heaven in terms of the church. We might consider that the physical representation of those who are already in the spiritual heaven. It's all one kingdom, but in the church, how do you enter it? You become innocent. Now, can you truly become innocent in the sense that you have never sinned? Well, no, obviously not. But you can have your sins washed away and become like one of these children. And so this works so wonderfully with what the actions of Jesus we saw earlier. He begs the children to come to him. And now when you have the teachings of Jesus, he says, "Come to me again as children." We go down a little bit further, and then somebody might say, well, look, it says that children can sin when it says in verse 5, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck, to be drowned in the depth of the sea." Well, right there it says Jesus said children can sin. Somebody can cause a child to sin. We should point out here that the word sin here, it might be wiser, it might have been wiser on the part of the translators to use a different term. I'm not being overly critical of them using the word sin here, but the word we usually translate sin is a term called hamartia, which means to miss the mark. It was a pretty well-established Greek idea of missing the mark. Here, the term is scandalize, which I'm pretty sure is where we get the term scandalize from in English, but that doesn't mean it means the same thing. Really, it means to stumble. So I think the term stumble here probably would have been a better translation. And so he says, "Whoever causes one of my children to stumble," is he talking about sin? No, you can't cause a child to sin, but you can certainly mislead a child. And certainly, later on in life, what you teach a child could cause them to sin. Something we need to consider carefully. And Jesus clearly thought it was a pretty big deal if you taught a child something that caused them to believe something that wasn't true and later would cause them to stumble. He said it'd be better if you would just have a millstone. If you didn't know, a millstone is an extremely heavy object, probably the heaviest object that would have been readily available in the minds of his audience at the time. You know, clearly the heaviest object in the minds of most cartoonists, at least back in the day, were anvils and pianos. You could maybe replace the same thing. It'd be better if somebody had an anvil or a piano wrapped around his neck and thrown into the sea. Well, what's that going to do? Obviously, it's going to kill him. He's talking about physical death. It would be better for you to die physically than the punishment for misleading spiritually. Really, while this is talking about those who would mislead children, it is a stark warning to anybody who would teach the gospel, and goes into one of the very consistent themes within the New Testament, specifically within the teachings of Jesus, which is warning against false teachers who would teach in the name of Christ, but do not teach what he taught. There are many people who would have you believe that essentially there are no false teachers of Christ today. That is sure not what the New Testament teaches. So there you go. A little bit of teaching about children there. What happened to, oh, there we go. Now, in Matthew's account, he is going to segue into talking about temptation. So now he's no longer talking about temptation towards children, but rather your own personal temptation and how you ought to deal with that. So let's look. Matthew chapter 18, verse 7 says, "Woe to the world for temptations to sin." It should be noted, by the way, that again, the word sin here is scandalize, so maybe it should say stumble. "For it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet than to be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes than to be thrown into the hell of fire." Okay. So, let's talk about what Jesus is saying here. He's talking about temptation. This is one of the more difficult teachings of Christ, and I think it's a place where a lot of Christians get things kind of wrong, because this is a deeply personal teaching. First of all, in the vast majority of cases, we should recognize he's probably not talking literally, right? I mean, I suppose if there was an extreme circumstance, where somebody just cannot seem to overcome a temptation, and the only possible way to remove that were to be to literally cut out one's eye or cut off their hand, then yes, that is what they ought to do, but I don't think there's any realistic situation in which that's the best course of action. Jesus says, if your right eye is causing you to sin, I know my right from my left, my right eye is causing me to sin, then I ought to pluck it out and remove it, because it's better that I lose that now than have my whole body thrown into hell. Again, in most cases, he's not talking literally, but he is talking about removing temptations from ourselves. Remember back in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, he gave us the model prayer, and one of the parts of that prayer was, "Lead us not into temptation." This is what he's talking about. It is necessary that every human being go through every form of temptation, just like Jesus went through every form of temptation. However, we can pray and hope that we are tempted minimally. If we are tempted minimally, then we sin minimally. So we ought to try to remove temptation from ourselves. What does that mean? That means that if I know, for example, that I have a problem with pornography, maybe it'd be better that I remove my access to the internet, if it is at all possible, than to continue with that and then continue in that sin. Is it difficult? Yeah. But it'd be better that I go through life without access to the internet than to have my whole body thrown into hell. I mean, it's one example of many. Again, if somebody knows that they can't enter into a gas station without picking up beer, right? And that's where the temptation seems to overcome them. Then, if I'm in that situation, it's probably better not to go into the gas station in the first place. Nowadays, you don't really have to, right? If you have a debit card or a credit card, you can usually do the entire interaction outside, and that might be the better thing to do. Now, where a lot of Christians, I think, get this wrong is then trying to take a place where they have removed temptation from themselves and then trying to enforce that on others. You can't do that. Right? I got to tell you, I'm not bragging on myself, but I'm not tempted to buy beer when I go into a gas station. So I don't think that's something I have to cut off from myself and remove from myself. But then somebody else who might have to do that shouldn't try to enforce that upon me. Do you see where the subtlety is? I don't know if I've mentioned this already or not, but C.S. Lewis once said that there is a certain kind of bad man who cannot give something up without insisting that everybody else also give it up. Now, in the context in which he said that, I actually disagree, because he was arguing in favor of some people completely giving up alcohol, which he believed the Bible didn't teach against. Respectfully, I disagree with him on that. Another argument for another time, though. But he did, his general point still stands. There's a reason Jesus spent so much time teaching against Pharisaism, teaching against the idea that I have the right to enforce my own personal boundaries that God hasn't necessarily put on everybody else. That's wrong. We can't do that. That being said, we should put personal boundaries on ourselves. Now, I can't tell you what your personal boundaries have to be, but you should have them. I absolutely guarantee you that there is some sin which uniquely affects you, which you can remove right now the temptation from yourself by moving further away. I can't tell you what that is because it's not going to affect everybody in the same way. But that's probably something for you to consider. Let's see. Something else here that we should mention. I think we've probably mentioned it a couple of times here, but we have a pretty clear teaching of the eternality of hell here, right? Verse 9, and if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with one eye than with two eyes, than to be thrown into the hell of fire. And then back up a couple of verses in verse 8, and if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. There you have Jesus very clearly teaching the eternity of hell. This is not parable, by the way. There's a little bit of exaggeration when we're talking about cutting off your hand or your foot or cutting out your eye. But at the same time, if it really came down to that, then I would say, yes, this is literal. Here you have Jesus talking about an eternal hell. A lot of people, of course, teach that hell is not eternal, that there is no hell at all, that everybody goes to heaven. Some people teach. Other people teach that what hell is actually annihilation, is the term, right? So it's essentially the atheist version of death. You have complete destruction, total destruction of both body and soul instantly, and you just no longer exist. Well, that's just not what the Bible teaches about hell. And I don't think anybody would teach those things about hell if it weren't for the fact that the true existence of hell is such an unpleasant thing to think about. I hate thinking about hell. I hate thinking about the fact that anybody is there. But just because I don't like it doesn't mean it's not true. Again, when you go into Mark's account of the same teaching, this is in Mark chapter 9, verses 43, starting in verse 43. Whoever caused one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, again, the word there should be to stumble. It would be better for him if a great millstone was hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to cut it off, or to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter eternal life than with 2 hands to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes, and to be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. I mean, listen to that description. The worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. That sounds like eternal hell to me. By the way, really within that section, that phrase where the worm does not die and the eternal fire is not quenched, it should have appeared at the end of every one of those sections. That's a textual issue that I think I've probably referenced a couple of times at this point. We'll probably get more in depth on it when we hit Mark 16, because it's the most famous example of that. But there you go. Yeah, it has, once again, this idea of the eternal hell, and Jesus teaching the same thing. All right, well, I think that should just about cover what I wanted to cover for today. Thank you so much for taking this time to study with me a little bit. Next time we're going to be talking about a couple of the pretty big parables of Jesus. And they are some extremely famous ones. So until then, I hope I get to see you then. Until then, love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.